Hello. Today I would like to introduce you to some ideas about the Declaration of Independence. I call it the Declaration of Independence and Rachel's Rubber Ducky. Now, this is a look at the logic and principles behind the Declaration of Independence. It is not a history of the historical personalities or discussion of the history behind the Declaration of Independence. So actually, probably we're going to take mostly a look at the first part of the Declaration of Independence and the last part of the Declaration of Independence, and the historical things in between. Those are for your history classes. Now, from a literary perspective, the Declaration of Independence is a persuasive essay. It is explaining why the 13 colonies in Eastern North America have decided to declare their independence from England. And it follows a somewhat standard essay approach with an introduction presenting its purpose and background, a body presenting evidence, and a conclusion, which in this case, the conclusion is a call for action for independence of the colonies. So if you look at it that way, then it helps us to understand what is going on. Okay, this is the way it begins. When, in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind require that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. So this tells us the purpose. Okay, it's a single sentence, it's a fairly long sentence, but it's a single sentence. And it says, okay, we have found it necessary to dissolve political bands between the 13 colonies in North America and England, and that they are declaring themselves as a separate and independent nation. This is, and notice the appeal is to the laws of nature and to nature's God. Okay, and I'll talk about that in a minute. And that they're doing it out of respect for mankind, that people probably want to know, why are they doing this? In the 18th century, many people still subscribed to the divine right of kings, or something similar. To go against the king would suggest you're going against God. But notice they're making an appeal to God in this introduction. So, there's something else going on here. But they figure that they should explain why they're doing this. Okay, so the laws of nature and of nature's God. If you think about it, the laws of nature and nature's God, okay, the laws of nature suggest inductive reasoning. Okay, this is what we would today call the scientific method. The idea that from observing things in nature, we draw a conclusion. Okay, so that is inductive reasoning. When you do a scientific experiment, you do the experiment, you repeat it a number of times, and if you get the same or similar results a number of times, you can come to a conclusion. Well, they're looking at the political situation in a similar manner, that there are certain laws that we can figure out from inductive reasoning, or today we would say from the scientific method. But also, so that's how we discover laws of nature. Okay, laws of nature's God would be deductive reasoning. Okay, and we have an authority such as the Bible or some other scripture, and it has certain statements. Okay, the statements are the given, and from the given we deduce things. So, obvious example, the Bible and most other religious writings will say, you should not kill or should not commit murder. Okay, so if someone takes another person's life, then we say, okay, that person has murdered him, and that's wrong. Okay, and requires some kind of justice. But again, in that case, we start with the law of God and apply it to a specific case, and that would be the deductive reasoning. Okay, and so they claim they're going to be using both kinds of reasoning in their explanation. And this is perhaps the key to understanding the Declaration of Independence. I suppose you could say the philosophical foundation. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, and that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Okay, I'm going to take these kind of little by little. First of all, we hold these truths. So they are saying that truth exists. I don't know why I'm getting that echo, but anyway, truth exists. Okay, there are certain things that we understand describe reality. Okay, now notice that it's not just truths, but self-evident truths. And this is important to understand because not all truths are self-evident. A simple example is the law of gravity. Now, gravity itself is self-evident. I step out, I don't float. I stay on the floor, I stay on the ground because the gravity is pulling me towards the center of the earth. In that sense, it's obvious to anyone. Even a little child falls down and realizes, oh, okay, I've got to stay balanced, something like that. Now, specific, say, gravitational formulas and things like that, it takes some, Isaac Newton or somebody to figure out how to do those. But the basic truth is self-evident. And notice, say, I had a math teacher that once talking about certain math proofs, he would just say, it's intuitively obvious to the most casual observer. And that's what we would say. It's obvious to anyone. And I really mean just about anyone, except maybe little tiny babies and a few exceptions like that. Okay, now created equal. What does this mean? First of all, we have to understand certain things. We're not created equal to one another. I guarantee you that I am not equal to LeBron James on the basketball court. In fact, few people are. That's not what we're talking about. Okay. On the other hand, I suspect I've probably read more books than LeBron James had. But that doesn't mean what we're talking about here. We're talking about equal treatment under the law. Okay. There was this sense that people from England were being treated differently from the British subjects in the colonies, and that wasn't fair. Okay, so under the law, and if you think about it, this is self-evident. This is a self-evident truth that we all want to be treated fairly. And you don't have to go to law school to understand this. If you have a family and you have a couple of siblings and your mother's cutting the dessert, cutting the cake or cutting the pie or something like that, I got to make sure that I don't get a smaller piece than my brother or sister does. That's the sense of fairness. I can remember in other families that had similar experiences. I had a couple of siblings going on a family trip. Nobody wanted to sit in the middle. Everybody wanted to sit on the window side. So we had to take turns. And sometimes you say, oh, well, she got to sit by the window 5 times. I only got to sit by the window 3 times. Hey, she got 3 cookies. I only got 1 cookie. It's not fair. We understand that. This is a beautiful picture kind of illustrating this from Time magazine. Yeah, look at the three kids. Yeah, she gets the big piece of cake, and the other two, well, they look disappointed. Well, that's understandable because it's not fair. Even little kids understand this. We want to be treated equally. We want to be treated fairly. And if government's not treating us fairly, then hey, there's a problem. Okay, so that's what we're talking about. Okay, we're not talking about equality in terms of physical prowess or in terms of intelligence or anything like that. We're talking about the way we want to be treated. Okay, we want to be treated fairly. Okay, and in that sense, we're created that way. We have that instinct to be treated fairly, and we understand if we're not treated fairly, we're going to complain about it, or if we can't complain about it, or if we can't complain about it, then we keep it inside and just kind of simmer. Okay, so fairness is self-evident. And that's what, the Declaration of Independence is suggesting to us. Okay, there were certain unalienable rights, and these are related to the self-evident truth concerning justice. Unalienable is a legal term, and that means it can't be taken away. Now, sometimes people will, by force or something, take them away, but they shouldn't be taken away because they're part of our nature. And even if somebody forces us to do something that we understand is unjust, we still have that sense, this isn't right, this isn't fair. And so it is a legal term. In fact, there is you can look it up in legal dictionary, there's a difference between inalienable and unalienable. Now, John Locke and others, and this is where these principles come from, actually, the writings of John Locke, although a lot of them go back to, Greek philosophers and things like that as well. They would argue that these things prove there is a creator with a moral sense, because these things are common to all people. Everybody has that sense of fairness, that sense of justice, that sense of wanting to be treated correctly. And also, it's proven using the scientific method, using inductive reasoning. And these three rights the Declaration of Independence mentions, and these are really foundational to human nature. The right to life. The right to life can't be taken away. It's part of who we are. It's universal and it's innate. No matter where you go in the world, there are laws against murder. Now, they might be interpreted a little bit differently. Some laws have first degree, second degree, third degree manslaughter, negligent homicide, but it's still wrong. And that is true whether you're talking about a huge country like India or China, or whether you're talking about some small tribe on the side of a mountain in New Guinea. They all have laws, rules, sanctions against murder. And this is self-evident. Okay, we can prove by the scientific method that this is true because these laws are universal. Everybody has them. But also, we can say that they're self-evident because if somebody threatens you and they want to take your life or something, you're going to do something to try to prevent that. In fact, we also understand the other side. If you know someone who's really depressed or something and says, "Oh, I don't know what's the purpose of living. I think sometimes I just want to take my own life." We say there's something wrong with that person. That person needs help. We understand that kind of instinctively that that isn't the way to look at life. So the right to life is something that's innate. Even a little kid, if a little kid's threatened, they're going to run away or cry or whatever. The right to liberty. the right to be free to do things according to your legitimate desires. Again, this is universal and innate. Now, some people have said, the right to swing my arm ends at your nose. That's true. I mean, you don't want to hurt other people, but we understand, again, no matter where you go in the world, there are laws against things that restrict people's liberty. There are laws against assault. There are laws against kidnapping. There are laws against rape. There, all these kind of things. There are laws against them. And again, no matter where you go, people are going to say, yeah, that's wrong. People ought to be free. They ought to have liberty. And again, this is self-evident. Most parents will tell you one of the biggest challenges of having a little kid is getting them used to car seats. Those car seats, hey, you put the kid in the car seat and they're all strapped in. And, I want to get out of here. They start throwing off their shoes and whatever because they want to be free. They want to be. Eventually they get used to it and they understand that the car seat makes them safer or something like that. But the initial reaction is, I want to be free. and a little kid understands that. You've probably heard the story. Kid is punished for misbehaving, and kid doesn't like to be punished, and so mother makes him sit in the corner for time out. And the little kid says, I'm sitting on the outside, but I'm standing on the inside. I don't want to be, my liberty's taken away by being made to sit in the corner for 10 minutes or however many times. It's innate, it's self-evident. We all want to be free that way. As long as we're not hurting other people, we want to live that way. And then the right to pursuit of happiness. Now, John Locke uses the word estate. Usually in modern terms we say property. The term pursuit of happiness actually goes back to Greek philosophers. I think it's Aristotle. The idea that a person ought to be able to work and earn a living and have his or her living protected as long as he's working honestly. And we understand this. And this is, again, unalienable. It's something that's part of who we are. And it's universal and innate. That no matter where you go in the world, there are laws against theft. And things related to theft, like destruction of property and breaking and entering and things like that. And again, this even little kids are like this. And this is why I want to talk about Rachel and her rubber ducky. Now, Rachel probably didn't have a cool rubber ducky that looks like Shakespeare like I do, but we can just imagine little Rachel, 2 years old, and she's playing with her rubber ducky. Rubber ducky, you're the one. You make that time lots of fun. Now, Rachel has an older brother, Joshua. Joshua's 5 years older, so she's 2, he's 7. That's a lot bigger. Joshua happens to be going by and sees Rachel, having fun playing with a rubber ducky, and he thinks to himself, ooh, I think I'd like that rubber ducky. She looks like she's having fun with that. So he goes over to it and grabs it away from her. What's Rachel's reaction? Is she going to say, oh, yeah, well, go ahead? No, she's going to start crying. She's probably going to say, Ma, Joshua took my ducky, whatever. We know instinctively that if we have property and someone else tries to do something to our property, that's not right. You don't have to be a lawyer to understand this. You don't have to have studied John Locke to understand this. This is universal. This is self-evident. And this is what the Declaration of Independence is talking about when it's talking about self-evident truths. That these things aren't complicated. And in fact, if we start thinking about it, it's really, really obvious. Now, next statement is that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. And indeed, when Joshua takes Rachel's rubber ducky away, what's Rachel probably going to do? It's going to say, Mommy, Daddy. she's looking to the authority figure in the family. In fact, if you think about it, family really is kind of the smallest form of government. And she's looking for her mother or her father to ensure justice. She's too little to get, to fight her big brother to get that rubber ducky back, so she's going to have to rely on the authority to do that. And so she does. And then, but think about this though, that's in terms of family. What if, for example, instead of Rachel's brother taking the rubber ducky, what if her brother had a couple of friends over and one of his friends took the rubber ducky? Then what would happen? Probably what would happen is Rachel's parents, or one of her parents, would probably go to the parents of the friend who took the rubber ducky and say, hey, your son, your daughter has Rachel's rubber ducky. Can she have it back, please? Now, most cases that would probably take care of it. But what if that parent were to say, no? That's my son's rubber ducky. That's not Rachel's rubber ducky. Then you'd have to find an impartial third party to decide between the two. Maybe you would, I don't know, call the police or call in a neighbor that both of you trust, something like that. And that's why we have governments precisely to settle these kind of problems when they happen. So to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. Okay, and hopefully Rachel could get a rubber ducky back without going to court. But we understand that this is why we have governments. It really is, as people say, a necessary evil. If we always respected one another's rights 100% of the time, and 100% of the people did, we could probably get by without a government, because nobody would be doing those kind of things. Okay, now the government is a recognized authority. In the case of, say, Rachel's family and her neighbor's family, it'd be someone that they both respect, whether it's a town policeman or a neighbor they both respect, or someone else in authority. And the problem then in the Declaration of Independence is, what if the government is not securing the rights in a fair and equitable way? And so it says, whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Okay. This is what good government does. And also, if, again, this is justifying their call for independence, to say if the government's no longer securing these rights, then the people have the right to form a new government. And in the case of the Declaration of Independence, they're declaring themselves independent of England. Now, it goes on to say, hey, this is not something to be done lightly. Prudence indeed will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes. And accordingly, all experience has shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer, while evils are sufferable, than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. That a lot of times people will put up with an unjust government because they're used to it, because, well, hey, it's better than nothing, or hey, it's good 80% of the time, or something like that. That, to actually change the government, it can't just be for trivial reasons. And because we understand that there's no such thing as utopia. Utopia means nowhere. There's no such thing as a perfect government. And so we understand that if you're going to change the government, it has to be for very serious reasons, and not for light and transient causes. Okay, and then kind of the introduction, kind of the end of the introduction says, when a long train of abuses and usurpations pursuing invariably the same object evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security. That, if the government goes too far and it becomes kind of an absolute despotism, to use their words, then the colonies have a right to change their government. And then this leads into the body of the essay, the evidence to prove or demonstrate that there have been abuses and usurpations. And so, as I said, this is really, just a standard essay form. This is kind of the end of the introduction. Now we're going into the body, and there's somewhere between 22, 24, something like that, specific instances which the Declaration of Independence mentions that the British government, and uses the term the king, because the king is the ultimate authority, that the king has done to take away the rights of the colonists. Some of them, for example, include quartering soldiers in people's houses and closing down the colonial legislatures and things like that. And there's a whole list of them. And so, they're trying to, the more evidence you have, the more persuasive your argument is. And so there is, as they put, a long train of abuses in the Declaration of Independence. So the proof then follows. As it says, to prove this, let's the facts be submitted to a candid world. So these are the facts. We're going to let people know this is what's going on. This is what's happening in our colonies. And it's repeated injuries and usurpations and establishing an absolute tyranny. Now, as I said, the purpose of this presentation is not to go into the 20 plus abuses and usurpations. And so there are approximately 24 specific reasons are given, and that would be, we would consider the body of the essay. And then one, I do want to mention just briefly, one proposed usurpation that was omitted, that the original draft actually had a statement about slavery. And that using crimes against one people, against the liberties of one people with crimes he urges them to commit against the lives of another. That it said that a good Christian wouldn't do this. I mean, the New Testament in particular has not sanctions, at least exhortations to free slaves. And this is something that at the time, British colonies, in fact, most countries in the world still did. Now, unfortunately, this was removed from the final draft because only three colonies objected to it, the 2 Carolinas and Georgia. And it was decided that it was better to have all 13 go along with the Declaration of Independence. So they unfortunately dropped this. So we had to settle this issue, 75 years later, or 85 years later with the American Civil War. So anyway, I do want to mention that because sometimes people say, oh, well, the Declaration of Independence is hypocritical. And they tried. I mean, in one sense, we all don't live up to our own expectations. So in that sense, they're no different. And then there is the conclusion. After all these complaints, after these 24 or so specific complaints, other countries, and even the King of England himself should understand why the colonies are declaring independence. What does this mean? Okay, first they express the frustrations of the colonies. In every stage of these oppressions, we have petitioned for redress in the most humble terms. Our repeated petitions have been answered only by repeated injury. A prince whose character is thus marked by every act which may define a tyrant is unfit to be the ruler of a free people. And so they're really challenging the authority of the king because he's not doing his job. It's not necessarily even because they don't believe in monarchy, it's just the king is not doing the job that he is supposed to. And then they said, we've tried. We have not been wanting in attention to our British brethren. We have warned them from time to time of attempts by their legislature to extend an unwarrantable jurisdiction over us. We have reminded them of the circumstances of our emigration and settlement here. We have appealed to their native justice and magnanimity. We've appealed to the sense of justice that people have, that their goodwill. We have conjured them by the ties of our common kindred to disavow these usurpations. Most of the colonists came from the British Isles, so we were Englishmen. They too have been deaf to the voice of justice and of consanguinity. This consanguinity, the same blood. We're the same people. We must therefore acquiesce in the necessity which denounces our separation and hold them as we hold the rest of mankind, enemies in war, in peace, friends. Okay? So, we are looking at ourselves as a separate country, and we are not considering ourselves a separate country from England. We can be friends with them, or we can have war with them. We therefore, this is their call to action, we therefore, the representatives of the United States of America in General Congress assembled, appealing to the Supreme Judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions, do in the name and by the authority of the good people of these colonies solemnly publish and declare that these colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved. So notice they are declaring independence. Notice their appeal is to God. Okay, they've appealed to the king time and time again. The one authority above the king is God himself. That gets back to the concept of the divine right. Okay, the king is placed there by God, but he's got to do what God wants him to do, and their appeal is to God. And so what does this mean? As a free and independent states, they have full power to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, establish commerce, and do all other acts and things which independent states may of right do. Okay, independent states do these things, and the United States of America have the right to do these things as well because we are an independent nation. Okay. Okay, and for the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortune, and our sacred honor. Again, appealing to God, divine providence, and this is really, if you think about it, the language of covenant. Okay, that we are saying this before God, but we're pledging it to each other, and we're willing to give up our lives, our reputations, our property, if necessary, to achieve these results. And some people did. There were a few, particularly in some of the areas where there was a lot of fighting, like in New Jersey. The patriots in New Jersey did have their property taken. Some of the signers were killed or imprisoned, whatever. Benjamin Franklin himself said, in typical Franklin sort of grim humor, and we must all hang together or we must all hang separately. But again, this is the way the Declaration ends, and it does make an appeal. I would mention one thing too about the American Constitution. The American Constitution came out of this. The preamble of the Constitution says they're establishing the Constitution, as the Declaration of Independence says, institute new government, and that's what the Constitution does. The blessings of liberty. Well, this is where the liberty comes from. It's from the Declaration of Independence. And particularly the Bill of Rights. If you start examining the Bill of Rights, you will see that each one of the items in the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the United States Constitution, all fall into one of those three categories, if not more: life, liberty, property. So for example, the first amendment has to do with freedom of religion, freedom of speech. Okay, it talks about not having a state government, not having a government-sponsored religion, not having a state religion. That's an issue of property, as well as liberty. Not only am I free to believe the way I want to believe, but if there is a state religion or state controls all the religious property, then they can tell people what to do. And so there isn't the religious freedom. So very interesting. And it's the same with freedom of the press and freedom of speech, or to be able to speak what you really believe, what you really think, and without the government restricting that in some way. And again, that's mostly liberty, but also it does involve property, because if the government owns all the printing presses, for example, then there really isn't freedom of the press, because the government can have the presses and other means of communication, which we have in our modern world, do those things that we do. So anyway, just something to think about as well. So I hope you've learned something from this, and maybe help appreciate a little more what our founders did. Thank you very much.